Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. Actually, I think AlexMercedCoder.dev will work too. But AlexMercedCoder.dev is the website. Okay, so for those in the past who've gone to AlexMercedCoder.com, GPD host, who sucks, screwed that up. I did pay to renew the domain, but they somehow disappeared my domain. So working that out with them as we speak. But in the future, hosting your domain or registering your domain, don't do it with GPD host, because they keep closing out my tickets, my support tickets, and not being very helpful. Anyways, on that note, continuing on, what I want to talk about today is this masterclass. So like all the reasons, or basically what is this in JavaScript? Because it is a little in JavaScript, especially if you come from like another language, this can be extra confusing in JavaScript because it doesn't work exactly the same. It's generally used the same way, but again, JavaScript has a sort of different object-oriented programming model that underpins it. It uses what's called prototypical inheritance versus just traditional inheritance. And I would watch my prototypes masterclass video to really understand that distinction, because it really isn't that important for understanding how to use this in JavaScript. It's really useful to know when you are a more advanced programmer and you're really trying to squeeze every little last bit of juice from JavaScript. But again, this is going to be more geared towards people who are just getting started with JavaScript, who are just really confused about this whole this thing. Okay, so let's create a file. I'm going to call that what's this.js. Okay, and really what you want to understand JS, I mean, this is understanding it in the context of functions, because this is a keyword that you can only use inside of a function in JavaScript. So let's say here I write this function, we'll call it test, and basically all I want to do is console.log this. Okay, I'm going to create two objects. We're going to create an object that represents me. So const Alex equals, name Alex Merced. And then we'll just create some other object, const Urkel, like from Family Matters. Do a lowercase Urkel. And then we'll do name Steve Urkel. Okay, and now here's the thing. We have this function that we created test. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add that function as a property to both of these objects. So actually, let me just do that. So we'll just have a property called test, okay, which basically equals the test function. So I'll just write it longhand to keep it as simple as possible. Test, test. So I have a property called test, and what does test equal? The test function. Okay, so let's take a look at three situations. Okay, I'm going to run test by itself. I'm going to run test as a property of Alex, so as a method nested inside of Alex, and test as a method inside of Urkel. And the idea here is that whenever test runs, it's going to console log this. So the question is, like, does this change in all three of these situations? Well, let's find out. Okay, so if I do node, what's this? Okay, see, we get three things. Like first, we get this big object. Okay, so you get this big object. This is referred to as the global object. Okay, so when you're talking about a global standalone function in Node, this is specifically for Node, it's going to be a little bit different in the browser, because the idea is that this always refers to the object that is calling the function. Okay, so what you don't realize is that any function that you create is part of this global object that exists when Node is running. Okay, again, not important that you know that, but now you're aware of it. So the idea is that in a standalone function, this is the global object, which generally has things that you may or may not ever need. And most things in the global object are things you can refer to without having to say like global dot. Like for example, like things like set interval, set timeout, which are functions you normally would just use standalone. The reason they can work as standalone functions is because they're all methods of the global object. And so, so just a little backstory. But again, now after the second time when I run it, test, notice it console logs the Alex object because it was the Alex object that is using the function. So when Alex runs the function, this is Alex. And when Urkel runs a test function, this is Urkel. Okay, so the idea is that this is always the object that owns the function. Okay, or whoever's invoking the function. Okay, that's it. Okay, that's literally like what this is in JavaScript. Okay, so I can write the same function. Like in this case, I wrote this function here, but because I nested it inside other objects, that shifted the context of what this is when I used it in the context of those objects. Okay, cool. Now, let's imagine I created let's imagine this function. Okay, function create Alex or create person. Okay, and then each person gets a name and an age. Okay. Now, first thing I'm going to do is I am going to create a function called constructor. Actually, well, there's function keyword. We'll just call it function and we'll call it construct person, which takes in a name and an age. And then again, it's going to take whatever object, whatever this is in the context, and say the name property of that object equals the name parameter, and this dot age equals the age parameter. Okay, so this is just an inner function, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create like const my new object or new person equals an empty object that the only property in that object is construct person. Okay, in the same way that and then basically what happens is we then say new person dot construct person, and literally what this is going to do is we'll pass it the name and the age that was passed into the create person function, and what that's going to do is going to add the name and property to this new object, and then we can return that object. Okay, if this seems like a lot going on, it is, and that's why JavaScript is going to give you an easier way to do this exact same thing. Okay, so I'm going to return the new person that was just created, and that's going to be all fun and good. So now watch what happens. If I say like const Alex equals create person, and then I pass in AlexMerced 37, and then we console.log Alex. Okay. Notice I end up with a new object called, well, let me spell my name right, AlexMerced. And that's all fun and good, okay? But let's say I wanted to create like, a function that creates people, a function that creates dogs. This is, this requires a lot of mental bandwidth to kind of think this through. So you're saying, okay, I'm creating a function that creates this constructor function and then creates an empty object with this with this constructor function, which that's why this is going to refer. So that's why when we run construct person here, technically this refers to the new object that's created every time we run this function, because we nested that construct person function in there. So that's the reason I'm showing you this, to show you kind of, because I am leading up to like classes and constructors. So the question is like, why does a constructor work? Because essentially under the hood, this is what's happening. The constructor is a function that you've designed, and then every time you create a new instance of a class, it's creating a new object and then running the constructor function in the context of that new empty object. And essentially you are constructing the new empty object, okay, at a high level. So that's essentially what's happening here. So this pattern right here is technically what we can do much easier using the class feature in JavaScript, okay? So you could just do it with functions. There are other ways to do it with functions that are a little bit simpler, but I want to be very explicit here so you can kind of see the steps that specifically classes will go through in a moment. So what if I wanted to kind of summarize this? The other way I could have done this is I could just use the class feature. I could just say class, we're going to have a person class, and then I define the class within these curly brackets. Okay, and we're going to say, hey, anytime you create a new person, you need a constructor function, which again is going to work like this construct person, where again, we create a new object every time you create a new person, and then we're using that construct person function as sort of like in the context. They do it in a slightly different way, using this method called bind behind the scenes. Don't worry about it. But essentially it makes it where this is the new object. So essentially when I run construct person, this is the new person, and that's why we're assigning, and that's what's editing the name of the new person and the age of the new person when I run this construct person function here. Okay? But to make that a lot simpler, they have classes, because all that sort of setup is done for you. All I have to do is just define the constructor function. So I can do the same thing, say, hey, every person has a name and age, and then I just assign it this.name, this.age equals name equals age. Okay, so that's all fun and good. Okay, nice. So now what I can do is that instead of using this create person method that doesn't exist anymore, I would just say new person, and this is going to essentially give me the same result. The only difference is that now it hides a lot of the guts from me. One, I don't have to really like think through all that constructor logic. Like I don't have to think through about like how is the constructor run and how does it know what the new object is. Okay, all that stuff that I had done explicitly up here is just kind of done under the hood for me. All I have to know is that, hey, this is every time I use the new keyword, it with some sort of class name after it, it's going to create an empty object and then run the constructor function in the context of that object. So that's why when I say this.name, it's assigning Alex's name. So it's really like me saying Alex.name, Alex.age. And then I'm assigning, the name parameter which is AlexMerced, to Alex.age, essentially. So we get that. Okay, so that's essentially how this works. This, again, just basically assumes that there's some sort of context. Typically, that context is assumed based on sort of like what object is running the function. So by the fact that I say like this object dot the method, the function, that's how it says, okay, this must be that object on top. But you could also run a function. Let me just make another video. So like more, what's this 2.js? So going back to that test example. Okay, so function test console.log this. Okay, I could do it the way we did before, but I could also do this. I could be like, okay, const Alex. Let's go back to our previous example where I created an object called Alex. Name AlexMerced. Const Urkel equals name Steve Urkel. Now the cool thing is every function is an object in JavaScript. So just like everything else has like methods and stuff built into it, so do functions. So test, I can do this. I can do test dot, and you see there's these methods apply, bind, and call. Okay, every time you technically what's happening, every time you do this, that's really the same thing as you doing like test.call. Okay, all literally call is call this function. Basically call the function that's in this object, and then you pass it the arguments. Okay, but the idea is that, again, any good language kind of hides these details from you, so that way you don't have to think so hard about it. So you just do that, and essentially what you're doing is you're calling the stored instructions you have stored in the object. Okay, but essentially we have this method here called bind, and what bind does is that it's going to run, it's going to return a new version of the function. Okay, so const new test equals test.bind, and what you do is you pass it one of these objects. So I'll say Alex. Okay, and what's going to happen is that new test is still a standalone function, but anytime new test runs, this is going to be Alex. I'm basically binding it to Alex. I'm saying anytime you run this version of the function, Alex is this. I'm explicitly telling you that. So now watch what happens when I run new test versus if I just run test by itself. Okay, and you see it's the second time it's using. Oh yeah, I ran the wrong file. What's this 2.js? There we go. So you see the first time when I just run test, it's still normal global function, so this is the global object. okay? But the version of new test that was bound to Alex is going to always use Alex as this. Okay, so hopefully that helps clarify how this works. Where this can be sometimes the most tricky is when you're working with the DOM. Okay, because for example, you might have a function that's triggered by a button click. And what happens, a lot of people get confused, is because they don't realize is that when the button triggers the method, this now like changes into the button. So you might, it might be the method of some object. So you might say, hey, whenever you click this button, run object.this. Okay, so you're thinking, hey, object is what this is going to be, but because it's the button that invoked it, which is another object in JavaScript, the button becomes this. And that's where like a lot of really tricky stuff with React once upon a time was, which nowadays you don't worry about anymore because a lot of that stuff has been kind of cleaned up and made much easier under the hood. But once upon a time, like that was a big issue of having to bind your methods and whatnot, so that way you can avoid a lot of this like really like messy stuff when working with the DOM and React. But hopefully this kind of makes this make much more sense. So have a great day and enjoy. My name is Alex Merced. Have a great day and enjoy.